tonight's lesson is going to be a little bit of a follow-up on a previous lesson I've done. Now, I did a video on this topic, a biblical explanation for Greek and Norse gods, okay? I did a video on this topic, and it was just something I did in passing. Somebody had popped into the channel, they asked a few questions, and I tried my best to answer those questions. So, that's all that was going on in that video. Now, this video got a lot more views, almost 3,000 views, on YouTube than I expected it would, okay? And so, you know, I want to kind of do a follow-up and maybe address some of the things associated with this video, because that's not at all what was intended when I put it out. So, the reason that I put it out was because Christians often are unaware of the relationship that mythology, and especially pantheons of deities, has with the Bible. A lot of Christians are just completely unaware and ignorant of the relationship between pantheons of deities, mythology, in the broader spectrum and scope of things, and the Bible. And so the whole reason I put out the video was to educate Christians on that topic. And I got a lot of comments that said, thank you so much, you explained it well. Okay, so that was good. But I also got quite a few comments of people really hating on my video. Okay, so here's Anthony Martinez. He says, the Christian mindset limits its perception of the world to a single point of view. So in order to support that single view, one must condemn all other beliefs, thus supporting the claim of the one true God. Naturally, they relabel pagan gods to demons or evil to fit their box of beliefs. They cannot comprehend any other deity as good, divine, or morally righteous, for it is the great deception of their devil. It's just not true. And something that Anthony doesn't recognize is, again, this is not at all the target of the video. The video is meant to educate Christians on how mythology fits into a biblical worldview, okay? Or Ed 4 Points says this, millions of Hindu people, not really almost none, because I said almost no people worship pantheons of religions anymore, pantheons of deities. Ed 4 Pints says, millions of Hindu people, not really almost none. Shinto, Buddhism, ancestral worship, etc. Polytheism or paganism is still prevalent globally, so has Jesus won yet? No. And point well taken. I said Jesus beat those deities, which is part of why I worship him. He's still in the process of beating them, right? Christian theology has always talked about the already and the not yet. So Satan's already defeated, but Satan's still in the process of being defeated. That's not against Christian theology. Joe Mann said, disrespecting my religion, Hellenism, I see. So there you go, right? Because I called out Greek and Norse gods, because I called out Roman gods, I'm disrespecting other religions, okay? Or, again, Anthony Martinez, they relabel everything that doesn't fit their Abrahamic bubble into evil demons or fallen angels, okay? So a lot of responses on this one, and here's what I want to say at the outset. I wasn't trying to attack any sort of pagan religions, right? We're all Gentiles. We all used to worship these pantheons of deities. My simple point was that in time, in history, Christianity has demonstrated itself to have victory over these various pantheons of deities. And I think that victory fits itself out in the biblical framework and in the salvation historical framework. That's my point. My point in that video and in this video really are not necessarily to attack other belief systems. My point is merely to point out how mythology actually fits into the Christian belief system. What are we to make of it as Christians, right? That's kind of where I want to go today. So a lot of people said, this guy's a pagan. He doesn't, a lot of people said that as a pagan, I'm a pagan. I think this guy has no clue what he's talking about. Okay, so that was a lot of the comments. What I want to do in this brief lesson tonight is I want to talk about, I want to use the two best comments from that video as a jumping off point to discuss these themes more broadly. And what I would like to point out is I want to go into several typical mythologies and just relate them to how Christianity and the Bible deals with said mythologies, okay? Because if you understand how mythology works, what the point of it is, you will see those mythological themes traced in the Bible, but they're given a different spin, Okay, so that's what I want to touch on. And I want to use these two comments. These are two great comments. I want to use both of these comments as a jumping off point for tonight's lesson. So first, Justin Hoffman said this: your theory would make sense if all those ancient texts didn't predate yours. And just so you know, the Bible never refers to it as God, only as Father and Spirit. God came from God Riel, an ancient name for son of the morning star. I challenge you to pick your religion apart, detail by detail. That's what this channel's about. We always do that. Also, your Christian faith worshiped two gods originally, one male and female. I don't really care about all of the latter half of the comment, but this first sentence is great. Your theory would make sense if all those ancient texts didn't predate yours. Okay, so I want to address that tonight. Okay, the other one, this was by Akshat Tiwari. This was a fantastic comment. They said this: Christianity, being the world's most followed religion, is almost 2,000 years old. On the other hand, Hinduism is the third most followed religion, dates back almost 4,000 years. And the Greek religion, more than 1,000 years. So who do we believe? Is the other religion's inspiration from the oldest religion in civilization, i.e. Hinduism? I'm perplexed. Please make a separate video on the same with proofs and theories regarding all. Hope this reaches you. Guys, like this as much as possible. Let's get this message to Pastor Tanner. Thank you. We got you, Akshat. So we're going to touch on this. Again, comment from Justin and comment from Akshat in today's video. What do I want to look at today? Essentially this basic idea. How does the Bible and ancient mythology fit together? How do these interact with each other? Do they overlap? Are they in contrast to one another? How do they fit together? That is what I want to jump in today. We've got this common complaint. The Bible just borrows from other religious traditions. Well, I want to make the assertion tonight that yes, it does, and no, it doesn't. And I want to answer the question, what are we to make of this? Now, I have a video, which is, I think, fantastic on this topic. Just jumping into it basically, okay? And this video is called Lecture 2. This is from Yale, okay? So it's a well-known, reputable university. Yale putting out a lecture, The Hebrew Bible in its Ancient Near Eastern Setting, Biblical Religion in Context. I'm just going to show a few clips from it and try to explain where I'm coming from when it comes to the Bible and mythology. I want you guys to know, especially for a Christian, that I am very open to mythology, okay? I think there's a lot of truth in mythology. I think there's a lot of truth in paganism. I think there's a lot of truth in these ideas. But how they relate to Christianity in the Bible is what I want to cover tonight. Okay, so I think that we could have some great conversations on this topic if we wouldn't just throw stones at each other, if we would actually interact and have a good conversation. My assertion this evening is that paganism, pagan religions, unlike the majority of people in the West, a lot of people in the West just think they're foolish. They're not true, they're not real, they're dumb. I can't believe anyone would believe that. My contention is not that that's the case, because a lot of Christians just do that, right? Those gods are fake. What are people are thinking? That's not what I believe. I believe that the gods of these ancient pagan religions, these pantheons of deities, are real, that they're spiritual creatures that were ruling over these areas and these arenas, and people were worshiping them, and that Jesus came to defeat those principalities and powers. That's my understanding of the Bible's narrative arc as it compares to these ancient pagan religions. Okay, so that's my approach, and that's what I want to talk about tonight. Let's go ahead and look in briefly to this video because I think it is so helpful to understand the relationship of Christianity and the Bible to pagan religions and pagan ideas and cultures. We're just going to listen to a little bit of this.
In the opening lecture, that this course is going to examine the biblical corpus from a variety of different viewpoints and take a variety of approaches: historical, literary, religious, cultural. And today we are going to begin our appraisal of the first portion of the Bible as the product of a religious and cultural revolution. The Bible is the product of minds that were exposed to and influenced by and reacting to the ideas and cultures of their day. And as I suggested in the opening lecture, comparative study of the literature of the ancient Near East and the Bible reveals the shared cultural and literary heritage at the same time that it reveals great differences between the two. In the literature of the Bible, some members of Israelite society, probably a cultural, religious, and literary elite, broke radically with the prevailing norms of the day. They mounted a critique of prevailing norms. The persons responsible for the final editing and shaping of the Bible, somewhere from the 7th to the 5th or 4th century BCE, right? We're not totally sure, and we'll talk more about that. But those final editors were members of this group, and they had a specific worldview, and they imposed that worldview on the older traditions and stories that are found in the Bible. That radical new worldview in the Bible was monotheism.
Okay, so I want to stop there and just make a few comments. Notice that she said there were prevailing norms, cultural ideas in the society at the time. And those who put together the Bible, started to, put together its contents, were breaking radically with what was going on, okay? That, I think, is a very key thing to understand. Notice that somebody made a comment, your theory would make sense if all of these ancient texts didn't predate yours. I'm not claiming that they don't, right? In fact, I agree with the professor that these ancient texts did predate the Bible. Here's the point on what the Bible does. The Bible takes these ancient predated texts and it seeks to put its own twist on them. It seeks to put its own spin on what's going on. So there were certain ideas of creation stories. There were certain ideas of floods. There were certain ideas of giants. There were certain ideas of all sorts of things in the societies and cultures at the time. And the Bible picks up these same myths, but then puts their own twist on it, puts their own interpretation on it. Okay? And that's what's going on. And what she said is the particular twist, the particular interpretation they put on the text was monotheism. That's the big difference. Okay? So these cultures are all existing alongside one another, but Israel comes along and they begin to interpret all of these concepts within the framework of monotheism. She said it pretty clearly there that this represents a dramatic shift in what was going on in the prevailing norms and the culture at the time. Okay. Now, she goes on for the next few minutes to talk about these old theories of religion, that they would evolve, right? You started out with a polytheistic religion, then it would turn into a henotheistic religion, and finally it would turn into a monotheistic religion, right? Polytheistic, many gods, you can worship all of them. Henotheistic, many gods, but you're only allowed to worship one of them. And then monotheistic, one God, okay? And for a while there was this prevailing theory that religions evolved from polytheistic to monotheistic. She essentially advances this theory by Kaufman that says, no, Israel marks a revolution in religion, not an evolution of religion. It's not as though you slowly get more and more close to monotheism. Monotheism represents a radically different framework of beliefs than polytheism does. They conceive of the entire cosmos differently. It's a completely different worldview. Okay.
Kaufman asserted that the monotheism of Israel couldn't be the natural outgrowth of the polytheism of an earlier age. It was a radical break with it. It was a total cultural and religious discontinuity. It was a polemic against polytheism and the pagan worldview. That's implicit, he says, throughout the biblical text. It's been said that Kaufman replaces the evolutionary model with a revolutionary model. This was a revolution, not an evolution.
So like I just said, this is not an evolutionary model. Instead, it's a revolutionary model. The idea being that monotheism radically breaks with some of the underlying principles surrounding, these pantheistic or pantheon type cultures, these polytheistic cultures, etc. You see, in these polytheistic cultures, you had this cosmos, this unseen realm that was beyond the gods, out of which the gods and goddesses emerged. Gods and goddesses were not all powerful. They didn't create out of nothing. They weren't all knowing or anything like that. Instead, they represent, in a sense, these superhuman level beings who are effectively implementing all of their ideas into the world. But they don't have hardly any of the attributes that Yahweh has from the New Testament and the Old Testament. So when you start to combine these ideas, you begin to see it's not as though the monotheism of the Israelite religion was really related to pantheism, but just some slight differences. It's a radical break, completely different way of viewing things. Let's go now to the next section, just another 30 seconds, and I think this is important to reiterate.
Now, one advantage of Kaufman's model is that we avoid some of this pejorative, we can avoid some of the pejorative evaluations of polytheism as primitive, right, as necessarily earlier and primitive and inferior. You're simply positing the existence of two distinct orientations, two divergent worldviews. They each have their explanatory merits, and they each have their specific problems and difficulties. It's not to say that Kaufman wasn't clear.
Okay, so I think that's a perfect example, too, of what I've been trying to say here. The point of my interaction with these ideas is not to bash these pagan worldviews or perspectives. It's not to talk down to those who worship pantheons of deities or anything like that. My simple point is to try and fit this paganism and pantheons of deities into the salvation historical framework in which we live, right? And so I don't have to be pejorative against pantheistic religions. We used to worship pantheons of deities. We used to be pagan. And my point is, this is why a lot of Gentiles have turned from paganism to serve Yahweh, to serve Jesus. Okay, so that's what I'm getting into with my content. I'm not talking down to paganism or anything like that. Now, okay, I've tried to make my case for this. The next thing I want to jump into is how then does the Old Testament recapture some of these pagan ideas, some of these ideas of pantheons of deities. So we're going to listen to one more minute of what she has to say, and then I'm going to walk through some examples of how these ideas interact, okay? So let's just go back.
Clearly judgmental, but at least the potential is there for us to understand these as two distinct systems, each, again, as I say, with its explanatory merits, but as we'll see, some of the things that monotheism solves only invite other sorts of problems that it has to wrestle with throughout its long life. Now, in Kaufman's view, the similarities, therefore, between the Israelites and ancient Near Eastern religion and cultures that everyone was so busily finding and celebrating, these were, in the end, similarities in form and external structure, appearance. They weren't essential similarities. They differed in content. Sure, they both have animal sacrifice. Sure, they both have ritual purity laws. Sure, they share certain stories and legends. But these have been adopted by the Israelites and transformed into vehicles that convey the basic ideas of the monotheistic worldview.
So that's a perfect place to stop. They've adopted these themes and transformed them. I want you to hear this again. Genesis itself is a polemic, okay? It's a polemic against other ancient Near Eastern religions' creation accounts. It's seeking to say, hey, we all know of this myth, we all know of this legend, here's how things really went down. Now, whether or not it's true or false, people are going to argue about. Obviously, as a Christian, I believe it's true. But it came along and was a polemic speaking out against a lot of these mythologies of the day. So we're going to stop interacting with this video at this point, and I'm going to go through a few ideas. The Old Testament recaptures and recasts many of the ancient mythologies that we find. It tries to frame them in a way that says, no, this is how the one true God created everything. It didn't go down the same way that you guys in all of your mythologies and ancient religions think it did. Here's how I'd like you to think of it, okay? God, now again, this is a Christian interpretation of how things went down. God created everything out of nothing, including spiritual creatures that we often refer to as angels. They had a certain amount of autonomy over creation, and they were supposed to serve alongside God and seek to fulfill his will and purpose for the spiritual world and the physical world. They were supposed to help in that, but they chose not to. They chose instead, not all of them, but some of them, chose instead to live out their own purpose and plan for the created order. And you see this in various falls throughout Genesis, okay? You see this in Genesis chapter 3 with the fall in the garden. You see this in Genesis chapter 6 with the flood. You see this in Genesis chapter 11 with the Tower of Babel. You have these various falls where these spiritual creatures are not following what God set them out to do. So in Genesis 11, God scatters the nations abroad and he appoints angels over each area of creation. And these angels are meant to serve and rule over these specific cities, these specific people groups. But what they do instead of pointing people to Yahweh is instead point people to themselves. And they say, worship me and give sacrifices to me. And I will show you things. I will help you to do things. I will help you to accomplish things. This is where the Genesis narrative begins to fit in. Okay, it's not that all of this stuff was written down first. It's that this is how things went down. And then later on, after you have all of these mythologies about how, Baal or El or all of these other gods created everything by slaying the dragon Tiamat, on and on you go. That's when Yahweh stepped in and was like, oh, they're propagating these lies about how the universe was created, etc. I'm going to have to correct that. And then the scriptures began to be recorded. So they are a response. They're a polemic. They weren't written first. I would assert that there's no reason for first to necessarily be best or right. That's not necessarily the case, okay? And so I'll examine that a little bit more as we go, but that's what I want you to see. And that's how I'd like you to think of it, at least from a Christian perspective. Now, here's what I want you to know, though. I am not, as a Christian, just saying, that's all silly. I don't know why Gentiles did that for thousands of years. Blah, blah. I'm not doing that, right? I want you to see that as a Christian, I'm lending credence to this perspective and this worldview because I believe it fits in with what the Bible teaches. But obviously, the Bible puts a different twist on it. It takes these stories, these mythologies that were going on during the time, and it seeks to reframe them and recast them in a different light, and in, I think, a more correct or proper light. Okay? So I think that's a very important idea. At this point, I would like to just review 4 key mythologies that are often talked about and compare what the Bible has to say about it with what ancient Near Eastern religions and others that are during that time had to say about it. First is the idea of the creation account, okay? First is the idea of the creation account. Now, if you read Herman Gunkel made a case that the Bible was not original in its creation account. Okay, he wrote this book called Creation and Chaos in the Primeval Era and the Eschaton. And we're not going to read it. I'm just going to look at the table of contents. Listen to what he says. First, Genesis 1 is not a free construction of the author. He says, look, this is largely a response to the Enuma Elish and other texts at the time. He goes into the Babylonian cosmogony. Okay, how all of these gods existed, etc. Allusions to the myth of the struggle of Marduk against Tiamat in the Bible, okay, talking about Isaiah, talking about the Psalms, Genesis 1, etc. The traditions of a primeval sea. Why is there a battle against Tiamat? Why is that echoed in the Bible when God defeats the sea monster? Okay, different ideas like that. The Babylonian origin of the creation account of Genesis 1, etc. Gunkel, if you go through the book, explicitly teaches that Genesis 1 is a recapitulating of Enuma Elish and other stories. With that, let's just go ahead and jump into the Enuma Elish. I'm not going to jump into the full thing, but I just want to give you guys a framework for what it's talking about, right? So, this is ancient text for the study of the Hebrew Bible, okay? And there's this section right here on the Enuma Elish, okay? Look at what it says. Enuma Elish shares several important motifs with Anzu myth, including the Tablet of Destinies, the conflict between the good and evil gods, the pronouncement of special names upon the victor. The author of Enuma Elish, or someone who influenced him, apparently took up themes to honor Ninurta in the Anzu myth and transferred them to Marduk. Okay, so you have these old gods, Marduk, etc. And he goes into all of the details about this. Tiamat, fighting Marduk, etc. Now, I just want to go down to the bottom here because he essentially begins to talk about how does the Bible incorporate this. Listen, many scholars believe that Enuma Elish influenced the author of the biblical creation story in Genesis 1, in which Yahweh moved over the watery Tehom, separated the waters from above from the waters below by splitting and then created the heavenly bodies and human life. Okay? So there you go. There's a relationship. And again, I want you to see Genesis here as a polemic It says, oh, here's how you guys have heard the universe was created. Well, we know the one true God who created everything, and this is how he did it. You see what I'm saying? This is the Jewish response to certain mythologies of its day. Okay? So creation accounts are mythologies that are found in a lot of cultures and societies. And the Bible has a certain take on the creation accounts. Okay, not only creation accounts, let's go on to the next one. Flood accounts. Flood accounts are very, very interesting, guys. Here I just want to bring up, this is Wikipedia. There are so many flood myths across the world, it's absolutely insane. Okay, so many. Just go to Wikipedia and look up this list of flood myths and you can see it. Flood myths are common across a wide range of cultures, extending back into the Bronze Age and the Neolithic prehistory. These accounts depict a flood, sometimes global, usually sent by a deity or deities to destroy civilization as an act of divine retribution. Africa, the Americas, so many of the Indians have all of these, the Native American Indians have all of these flood myths and accounts, right? South America, Mesoamerica, Asia, right? Ancient Near Eastern, Sumeria, Mesopotamia, Abrahamic religions, China, Iran, India, and some of them are remarkable. Look at India's account. The legend first appears in the Shatapatha Brahmana and is further detailed in Matsya Purana. Listen to this, guys. Matsya, the incarnation of Lord Vishnu as a fish, forewarns Manu, a human, about an impending catastrophic flood and orders him to collect all of the grains of the world into a boat. In some forms of the story, all living creatures are also to be preserved with the boat. Does that not sound exactly like Noah? To me, that sounds identical to Noah, right? Iran's is very similar. The Videvdad mentions that Ahura Mazda warns Yima that there will come a harsh winter storm following by a melted snow. He is advised to construct a vara, an enclosure. This he is to populate with the fittest of men and women and with 2 of every kind of animal, bird, and plant, and is supplied with food and water gathered together from the previous summer. It just goes on and on and on, guys. If you go through all of these ancient myths, Thailand's was really good, right? Thailand, okay? 1,000 years passed, their descendants were wicked and crude, as well as not interested in worshiping the supreme God. The God got angry and punished them with a great flood. Fortunately, some descendants survived because they fled to an enormous magical gourd. So there's obviously differences between them, but there's much more in common between them all than there are differences, okay? And here's my point. These line up with the biblical narrative of Noah and the flood, and they're from all across the world. We looked at India, Iran, and we also looked at Thailand. You could look at Indonesia, Malaysia. There are plenty in Mesoamerica, South America, the North American Indians. Tons of the Indian tribes had perspectives on these. This seems to be universal in culture and society. Here's my point. It probably happened. That's why I think it was universal. Okay? Now, every culture and society may have their own interpretation of it. They may have their own rendition of it, but fundamentally speaking, I believe it occurred. And I think that is what is important. Now, the only question that needs to be asked is which account is correct or most accurate. Okay? That's the question that needs to be asked. And I think that's the biblical account. Not only flood accounts, guys, but there are giant and rebellion accounts. I don't want to pull up any specific documentation on this one, but if you've heard of any Babylonian myths with Apkallu in them, you have these ideas that the Apkallu came down and they gave these gifts to men and they distributed them and men were happy about them, on and on you go, right? These are very similar themes to Genesis 6. You also have Greek gigantomachy. You've got, these Nephilim type creatures who are part God, part human, Heracles, Achilles, etc. And of course, that lines up pretty closely with Genesis 6, the Nephilim, and of course, so many of the giant clans in the Old Testament. You've got Og, the Anakim, the Rephaim, Gibborim, etc. So again, we have giant accounts, rebellion accounts in a lot of these ancient Near Eastern religions, in a lot of these cultures that focus heavily on, pantheons of deities and multiple gods and all this type of stuff. And many of those accounts line up pretty well with what the Bible teaches on this topic. Finally, guys, the divine council. Okay, the divine council is a very interesting idea. Now, there is a book on, let's see if I can find this one. There's a book on Canaanite myths. Yes, Canaanite myths and legends. And I just want to bring this one up for you guys, because there is an event that happens in the Canaanite myths and legends called the Legend of Carrot. Okay, the Legend of Carrot. Now, what I want to point out here is the Carrot is sad that they aren't able to produce offspring. Okay, and they have a dream where the one supreme god El comes and tells him, hey, you're going to be able to have some offspring, do these sorts of things. Okay, and in the narrative, a divine council is called to discuss what's going to happen. Okay, so let me just scroll down to it. And right here, listen to this. The beginning of one of the columns says this: Baal rises in the assembly of gods, convened, it appears, at Carrot's house, and urges El to bless the king. El, taking a cup in his hand, blesses Carrot and promises that the wife whom he is about to marry shall bear him 8 sons. One of these, called Yasib, and presumably the eldest, will be suckled by Athiret and the virgin Anat, the nurses of the gods. Right? Further down, okay? Further down, it says this: El, addressing someone who says is as wise as himself, and therefore presumably Baal, tells him to fetch Elsh, the steward of the gods, and his wife. This done, he sends them to the top of a building, apparently, as the next column suggests, to summon the assembly of the gods. And then, of course, the next column, El calls 7 times on the gods as they are gathered in assembly to see if any who will do anything to banish Carrot's illness. There you go. So you've got this idea of a divine council. This is also a biblical idea, okay? Psalm 82, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment, okay? Or 1 Kings 22:20, and the Lord said, well, I'll start in verse 19. Micah said, therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing beside him on his right and on his left. Look, all of the host of heaven standing on his right and his left. The Lord said, who will entice Ahab that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? One said one thing, another that. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will entice him. You've got this divine council. Yahweh, the Lord, is standing in judgment over it. He has taken his place, he holds judgment, and he is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Job 1 is similar to this. In Job 1, you have God, and then Satan, the accuser, comes up and starts talking to him. Okay? Now, I am not intending in this short section to go in detail into divine council accounts, into giants and rebellions, into flood accounts, or into creation accounts. That's not my purpose and intention with this short lesson. Here's my point. My point is that, yes, of course, the Bible draws on many of the mythologies and the conversations that were going on in the tradition at the time. But what the Bible does is it seeks to take that information in and recast it in a different light. As far as I am concerned, I think there's 2 ways of interpreting this. First, you could say this is mass borrowing from one another. Oh, see, the Bible didn't come up with it uniquely, therefore it can't be true, right? Or the Bible has the false account. But I don't think that's the case. And I don't think mass borrowing makes much sense when you consider all of the accounts of the flood, okay? The flood accounts are literally worldwide. You cannot have mass borrowing amongst all of these different nations. How on earth would the ancient Near Eastern religions borrow from North America, Mesoamerica, and South America? Or, conversely, how would they borrow from the ancient Near Eastern religions? No. So that's one account of it. That's one idea behind what went down, but I don't think that makes much sense at all. Instead, I think it's much more likely that these accounts are all true in some way, shape, or form. Okay? I think it's much more likely that these point to eternal truths. So, the divine council, there's a reason we find it in some ancient religions, and the Bible affirms it, but puts its own twist on it, right? There's a reason that giant and rebellion accounts are consistent throughout many ancient Near Eastern religions. There's a reason for many flood accounts. There's a reason for creation accounts. My point is I think they're true, and I don't think necessarily that what came first is what matters. Think about when things are often written down, guys. Some things are written down as a result over controversy or even over fear of being lost, okay? This happened a lot in the early church. You didn't get a lot of doctrine on the person of Jesus until different groups came along and started trying to refute the divinity of Jesus. Then they talked about it, okay? That's when they wrote it down. And so I think the same happens to be the case here. In fact, it's the pattern of the Bible and Christian religion in general to subsume the concepts, the ideas, the frameworks of the culture and society in which it finds itself, and to prove itself victorious over it. This is what Christianity does, and it's my contention that this is what Christianity did with all of the pagan religions of the world, essentially. And it's taken time, and it is continuing to take time, but finally, Christianity is subsuming all of these religions. One final comment I want to say on this, right? This may not necessarily happen in our lifetime, okay? You know, the trajectory of history takes a while to unfold. Somebody said that Hinduism is growing right now, and that might very well be true. I think that in general, the West has undergone a great experiment to try and prove everything through scientism and rationality, and it has resulted in absolute disaster. And as a response to that, I think that instead many people are turning back to religion. And so I imagine that many religions, including Hinduism, are growing and thriving and succeeding right now. My point is that in the long game, in the mass trajectory of things, we used to be, almost all of us Gentiles, pagans. We used to, almost all of us, worship pantheons of deities, and that number has continued to diminish through time, and I think that will continue. I don't think it's necessarily a straight line. There might be peaks and valleys, but over time, Christianity is demonstrating itself to be victorious over all of these other gods and goddesses. Here's my point. Jesus conquers Satan. Satan was ruler over this earth, and Jesus conquered him, crushed the serpent's head, and now paganism and polytheistic religions are continuously finding themselves to be without as many supporters. And Christ is taking over the world, in a sense. That's my approach, and that's how I read these things. All right, I'd appreciate any of your guys' comments, feedback, ideas, but that's kind of my theory. In the future, guys, I'm going to go in much more depth into the divine council. I know that probably confused some of you guys, the giant and the rebellion accounts, etc. But these are biblical themes, and it's just taking all of these myths during that day and age and trying to correct it, right? As far as my reading is concerned, again, I'm a Christian pastor, so don't be surprised when I take the Bible seriously, right? As far as I'm concerned, there were all sorts of ideas about what was going on when it comes to giants, divine council, etc. And the Bible comes along, and God says, let me set the record straight. This is how things went down. This is how things occurred, etc. That's the point. Okay, so I hope this helps. Like I said, got a lot of comments on my biblical explanation for Greek and Norse gods video, and I just wanted to go ahead and clarify where I stand on some of those issues.